So how many people died in this anti-government insurrection, shall we call it?
Well, I think it was an anti-government insurrection, and they made it very clear from the very first days that they wanted Daniel Ortega to resign. They expected the government to resign, and they used the violence that they instigated in the protests. They wanted deaths. They wanted to create deaths so as to be able to blame them all on the government. But in fact, what happened over the first weekend between April 18th and which was a Wednesday, through to April the 22nd, which I think was the Monday, there were a total of 20 deaths, and of those, half were Sandinista supporters or police officers, and the other half were people who mostly just got caught up in the fighting. There may have been a couple of opposition activists who died in that fighting, and it's simply not true to say that the police overreacted. They were faced with an extremely violent assault. And what do you think would happen to police in London or in Boston, say, if they were confronted with extremely violent and aggressive rioters who were using handheld mortars targeting the police? And do you think that the police in Boston or the police in London would take that as a peaceful protest? Of course they wouldn't. So why are we applying this double standard to the Nicaraguan police when they're faced with extreme violence? And people will say, the opposition supporters will say, oh well, those handheld mortars, they're just fireworks. But in fact, what they did was they packed these mortars with a charge around shrapnel and sharpened nails and screws and other metal, and that's what they used to fire at the police officers and their other targets. And that's why the police officer, for example, there was a policewoman who suffered permanent injury as a result of being struck by one of these mortars. And the supermarket worker that died, he died as a result of being impacted by one of these handheld mortars. So right from the start, the protests were extremely violent. It's not true that they were peaceful protests. It was definitely the definite intention was to overthrow the government. So what happened as a result of Daniel Ortega's decision that same weekend to call for a national dialogue was that the opposition had to rethink their tactics.
When you say the opposition, are you referring to the political people or the kind of activists we talked about who were connected to NGOs and had money?
The traditional political parties, opposition political parties, played practically no role at all in the...
So where did these, I mean, are you saying there were workers in the NGOs who were, doing this, or were they supported and funded by...
So the people that were active and violently active were people from the opposition party, the people that supported the so-called Sandinista renewal movement, their main source of income was from non-government organisations that they ran. So you had but they had no representation in Parliament. They had no representation in the legislature. So you had the mixture of the right-wing reactionary Catholic Church, which was using church resources to fund these violent attacks. You had the right-wing business people who decided to ally themselves in that opposition alliance, and they were paying for them. They were paying local thugs and delinquents to engage in these attacks. You then had the NGO sector that were using their NGO resources, supposedly for non-profit purposes, to fund the attacks and the general violence. So those were the three main elements that were funding the violence. Who was taking part in the violence? It wasn't the students. The middle-class students that had been in the original protests on the 18th and 19th quickly disappeared because they found that they were being involved in violence, and they just didn't want to be involved in that. So that was the initial onslaught. Then when Daniel Ortega...
So these students, they were connected to the, if you like, the other Sandinistas who pulled away in the 90s. What was their kind of...
Well, no, the opposition students who took part in the initial protests were a very wide spectrum of political opinion. Some of them were associated with the Sandinista renewal movement, but most of them were just students who'd been fooled by the propaganda. And they especially from the private universities. For example, up in Esteli. In Esteli, where I live, there used to be a big private university that was run by the church. The right-wing bishop in Esteli, Abelardo Mata, organised the students to come to a protest that was ostensibly peaceful. And this was a pattern that was repeated throughout the 3 months between April, May and June. The church in particular would organise a largely peaceful protest into which the more violent opposition would insert their shock groups. And the shock groups would then instigate the violence, ostensibly from a peaceful protest, but they instigated the violence, to which the police then had to respond in some way. But what happened as a result of the national dialogue was that the initial onslaught of violence abated quite quickly before the end of April, and then in the early days of April, the opposition redesigned their strategy. And as I said, what they started to do was to try and introduce an economic blockade that would force the government to make concessions. And how did they do that? They did that by means of roadblocks, which were operated by paid thugs, some opposition activists, mostly by paid thugs. And what they did was they forced the general population to have to pass through these roadblocks. Often they'd have their things stolen from them. If they were identified as Sandinistas in some way, they'd be beaten up. And it was a tactic of interrogation, of intimidation. And what they also did was they set up centres of operation. For example, in the two universities, they took over the Polytechnic University, the UPOLI, they took up the National University, the UNAN, and they occupied those universities, of course, destroyed infrastructure. But the most important thing is that they used those universities as a base of operations, so that at night they'd go out and intimidate and the population, terrorize the population. And there are so many incidents of Sandinista supporters being identified, brutalized, killed, set on fire, and in very numerous instances of that kind of violence.
So what you're saying, it's the equivalent of, say, one of the Palestinian support marches, a peaceful march in London, and a load of football hooligans moved in and just started chaos. And while the peaceful protesters then, they didn't want to be part of that, and you were just left with this violent mob who just took control of the situation, but it was labelled as part of the original peaceful protest.
Yeah, and that's not a bad analogy. And let me give you a practical example. On May the 30th, in 2018, there was a big march for Mother's Day. And it was a huge march. The opposition mobilised, I've forgotten how many it was. It was over 100,000 people that they mobilised. And there was also a counter-march, a peace march by the Sandinistas, and they were kept apart. But the shock groups, the opposition shock groups, infiltrated the march, of the opposition march. And there was shooting in which I think a total of 12 people were killed.
Oh, I think we had this on the TV in the UK.
Right.
Right.
But half of those people were Sandinistas.
Okay.
Sandinista supporters.
Yeah.
And also, there were over 20 police officers suffered gunshot wounds in that incident. But Amnesty International came out and said, oh, well, it was police snipers. But what are police snipers doing shooting at their own comrades? You know, and it's just completely ridiculous. What are police snipers doing shooting at Sandinista supporters? Just completely illogical.
Yeah, because that's the way it was presented on British TV.
Yeah, and a complete lie. A complete lie.
So how have we got to where we are today now from that, right? So what's happened? Has the government become more authoritarian, or just less patient with opposition views, or what would you say since 2018?
I wouldn't say that the government's become more authoritarian. What I'd say is that they've started being realistic, and that no society, no government anywhere is going to tolerate the level of violence, or the level of subversion, or the use of foreign money, supposedly for non-profit purposes, but actually being used for political purposes. No, the United States government wouldn't tolerate it, the British government wouldn't tolerate it, the Irish government wouldn't tolerate it, but somehow they expect the Nicaraguan government to tolerate it. And it's just the double standards that are applied are absurd. So what's happened since 2018 is the government initially attempted to be conciliatory, and they offered an amnesty. So even people that have been responsible, it's important to remember that 400 police officers suffered gunshot wounds between April the 18th and July the 17th. But we're asked to believe that this is as a result of peaceful protests. It's just it's ridiculous. And if that level of violence had been applied in the United States or Britain or Ireland, the police response would have been overwhelmingly violent. And that was not the case in Nicaragua. What happened in Nicaragua, as you mentioned earlier, is that as part of the national dialogue, a condition that the church hierarchy insisted on because they were the ones mediating the national dialogue, mediating it really in favor of the opposition. They insisted that the police be taken off the streets. So that's what happened.
It is rather ironic that we have a situation in Israel where they're allowed to defend themselves and go into Gaza and kill 40,000 people with no sanctions, and yet sanctions are put on Nicaragua for trying to stop these riots.
Well, for engaging in what the United States, British and Irish governments would do as a matter of routine to defend public order. But anyway, in 2019, the government offered this amnesty to the opposition people that had been arrested on criminal charges and sentenced to jail. And one thing that's interesting is that the Vice Foreign Minister at the time of the events in 2018 asked the representative of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, well, why aren't you trying to give the proper context about all the opposition violence? And the representative of the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights didn't deny that there was opposition violence, but he said that's beyond our remit. Our remit is only to address possible human rights violations by the Nicaraguan government. And the criminal justice system is the appropriate forum for dealing with anything else. But when the Nicaraguan government applied the criminal justice system to all the crimes that had been committed by the opposition, the extremely violent crimes, including massacres, the Inter-American Commission turned around and said, "Oh well, these people are political prisoners." And so I only mention that as an example of the double standard. So you had people who'd been, for example, Medardo Mairena, who was convicted of being the organizer of a massacre of 5 police officers and a school teacher in a town called El Morito. He was a beneficiary of the amnesty. And the condition of it was a conditional amnesty on the basis that people who accepted it agreed not to reoffend. So then that amnesty process took place. The government made an effort at national reconciliation again. And then through 2020 and into 2021, which is an election year, the United States government again started funneling money through non-profits to fund political opposition so as to disrupt the elections in 2021. And the Nicaraguan authorities then applied the law. For example, in the case of Cristina Chamorro, who is the daughter of Violeta Chamorro, the former president. She was the person who ran an NGO called the Violeta Chamorro Foundation. And she, in January 2021, she was found to be unable to account for $4 million that she'd received from the National Endowment for Democracy and the United States Agency for International Development. And so that money was being obviously earmarked for political activities to disrupt the elections in November of 2021. So the government took measures against the people who had promised not to engage in activities that were illicit, and that was an obviously illicit activity, being unable to account for $4 million from a non-profit foundation. That in itself is a criminal offence, and it was obvious that it was being used for political purposes to fund disruption of the elections in 2021. So, and that happened in different areas involving a large number of people who'd been beneficiaries of the amnesty, so they were arrested.
So the Sandinista won again in 21, and how are things today in Nicaragua?
Well, Nicaragua had to overcome the loss of about $1.3 billion, perhaps even more, of its GDP through 2018, 2019, as a result of the attempted coup. Right? Anybody who supports the government regards the events of 2018 indisputably as an attempted coup. And the economic effects of that, the immediate economic effects were over $400 million worth of direct damage, the loss of over 100,000 jobs as a result of disruption to businesses that were unable to keep going as a result of the disruption to normal economic life, and the total loss to Nicaragua's GDP. Some people put it at over $2 billion, but it was certainly over $1 billion, which for Nicaragua is a large sum of money. It's something like, what would it be, something like 15% of GDP. So the government had steadily recovered from that. Then they were hit by the two hurricanes in November of 2020, I think it was, Eta and Iota. That was another big hit to the national economy. And then they were hit by COVID.